whose work focuses on Karl Marx and the Republican political tradition. Bruno's the editor, is the writer of a book that's coming out in November 2024 this year, called Citizen Marx, Republicanism and the Formation of Karl Marx, Social and Political Thought. Bruno's going to give his introduction, and then there'll be time for questions, contributions. And Bruno will be giving the answers from everything from atomic theory to riddles and rhymes. So no pressure, over to you.
Yeah, no pressure. Hi everyone. Hello. Thank you very much, Yasmin, for inviting me, and thanks for turning out to listen to my new book. Book that's on Citizen Marx. Are we able to move this way? So these some slides for you, perhaps?
Yeah. Okay, it's okay. Go.
And then I just press down here, do I? For the next slide. Yeah.
Yeah. Or
or I can do it with the mouse. Does that work?
Yeah.
How about if you give me the mouse over here, then I can reach you with my left hand. Yeah. Great. Okay. Yeah, so the book's coming out in November 2024. I'm glad it's finally coming out. I've been working on it for a very long time, probably over 10 years. So it was a bit of a relief to have it finally at something to be able to hold it in my hands. So where shall I start? So maybe best place to start maybe with the title. Why is it Citizen Marx? So basically, in 19th century, before everyone called each other comrade, kind of standard form of address amongst radicals was citizen, which goes back to the French Revolution. There's a kind of like egalitarian replacement for aristocratic titles. And so that is a practice that continues for various socialists throughout the 19th century, including for Marx and various letters and so forth. And you can see that this is the first English translation of the Communist Manifesto, which appears in a newspaper called the Red Republican, the Chartist Journal, in 1850. And here the editor introduces Marx and Engels as citizens Charles Marx and Frederick Engels. So that's where I get the title of the book from. The translation is also, it's quite very interesting translation. The journal itself is very famous in various, famous particularly, unfortunately, for one line. You might know that, rather than translating the opening line that a spectre is haunting Europe, this translation had a frightful hobgoblin stalks throughout Europe. It's a bit of a shame. The translation is actually a really good translation. It's by Helen Macfarlane. She's a really interesting socialist and early feminist. Who has a lot of her own articles in the Red Republican. But it's a sad, like rather cruel translation as overshadowed by that line, although it's perhaps understandable why it is overshadowed by that line. Okay. So what is the big overarching argument of the book? So I think the central kind of thesis that I'm trying to defend in the book is that the importance of, if you want to understand Marx's thought properly, you need to understand the influence that republicanism had on his thought. And that has been neglected so far in the literature. That's kind of the central argument. Now, by influence, I mean two things. I mean, one, of course, kind of positive influence, the way in which republicanism influenced Marx's ideas. But I also mean it in terms of negative influence, the way in which Marx defined himself against republicanism. So those are the two things to keep in mind. I'm not strictly trying to argue in the book that Marx is a Republican. There's a lot of that kind of attempts to draw everyone into the Republican tradition. That's not what I'm necessarily trying to do. I think it's also important to understand the way in which Marx departs from republicanism, as important as it is as to how he integrates it as well. Now, as I say, I think that influence has been neglected in the literature so far. So, very common, one way to think about this is there's one very common way to present the influence of Marx's ideas. That goes all the way back to Lenin from 1913. And he says that Marx had three primary intellectual influences: German philosophy, French socialism, and English political economy. And now, in its own terms, that kind of tripartite division is rather problematic in any case. It's not really English political economy, it's really Scottish political economy, if anything. It's also not the case that it's only French socialism rather than English or German socialism that influenced Marx in these ways. But from the perspective of this book, one thing I argue that it really misses out is the importance of, European republicanism. as a source of influence on Marxist. So if you like, you think about it in a way that the book is kind of trying to add that fourth aspect of influence to our understanding of Marxist thought. So at this point, it might be useful to give a bit of a sense about what I mean by republicanism, or what republicanism is in the 19th century. So one way to think about it is in relationship to kind of various competing political formations at the time in the 19th century, the main political formations. Now, it might be a bit too small for you at the back to see what it says there, but it's got, on the left, it says the radical Republican, in the middle, the liberal constitutionalist, and on the right, the conservative absolute monarchist. So these are, at least for the first half of the 19th century, the three predominant political formations. As you see, socialism is not on the table, right? So the left-hand side of the spectrum is taken up by republicanism rather than socialism. And it takes a long time over the 19th century for socialism to become the predominant left-wing ideology and to replace republicanism. And so what you can how you can differentiate between these different political formations is looking at which political state they are aiming for or trying to achieve. Right? So conservatives on the right wing are arguing for an absolute monarchy. At the time, examples, let's say, like Prussia or Russia. Liberals in the middle, for example, a regime like that in Britain, a constitutional monarchy, which kind of takes away some power from the king, constrains it by a parliament, a constitution, various civic rights and so forth. But very specifically, it's not democratic. Right? So this is what separates liberals and republicans in the 19th century, is that republicans are arguing to go all the way over into full democracy, universal suffrage. Whereas liberals believe in property qualifications and a very much more limited sense of what democracy and representation might mean. So those are the kind of, as I said, the kind of main differences that exist at the time. Now I want to talk a little bit. So what are the kind of like ideas that are associated with republicanism at the time? So obviously, very crucially, democracy, stress on political participation, popular sovereignty, and also a particular idea of liberty as well. So the Republican idea of liberty, I think, has been one of the main kind of things that have been kind of unearthed by political theorists over the last 20, 30 years as something that republicanism, the history of republicanism, has something to offer to us today. So we think about what main meanings of freedom are today. So kind of a very typical understanding of freedom today is going to say freedom is non-interference. So you are free whenever you are interfered with. There's also an idea of positive freedom, which is ideas about where psychological limits that might inhibit all kinds of freedom. And Republican freedom is different. So Republican freedom is very political. And sometimes it's called the literature of freedom is non-domination or freedom from arbitrary power. So it's not just about the simple interferences that people can have, it's about arbitrary interference or domination. And there's a difference there. So in some ways, Republican freedom is broader than a kind of liberal idea of freedom. So you can be unfree even when no one interferes with you. So if you're subjected to an arbitrary boss, an absolute monarch, a landlord, these are very figures who might have dominating power of you and therefore make you unfree. And that's the kind of link that Republicans make between freedom and democracy as well. But in order for that power that's exercised over you by the state not to make you unfree, you have to have democratic control over it. And that's the kind of ideal of freedom that motivates Republicans in the 19th century. And I'll also argue is going to be important for Marx as well. And here I've just got a few examples on it. I hope you can read the text. It's a bit swashed in this version now, I see. But you've got examples, people like, for example, William James Linton, who writes very important and interesting text, The English Republic, which kind of really ties together 19th century republicanism back to the kind of Commonwealth history in England of the 17th century. All right, so hopefully that gives you just a little brief sense of what republicanism is. Let me move on to what is the actual, so I said, that republicanism is very important to Marx, but obviously we need to specify it a little bit more than that. In what way is it important? Like, how did republicanism influence him? How did it change over his life? So the kind of overarching argument I make in the book is that Marx's relationship to republicanism can be understood in three main phases. And so the first, Marx starts off his political career as a young man, as a Republican. He then transitions from that to a position of communism, 1844, 1845, which involves a kind of complex integration and rejection of various Republican themes. And then finally, towards the end of his life, it's not that old by that time, but by 1871 and the Paris Commune, it allows a fuller reintegration of republicanism into communism. So that's the kind of three-part story that I tell in the book. And I'll just start give a bit of a sense about what I say in each of those parts of the book. So let's start with Marx as a young Republican. So I open the book with a chapter on Marx's early journalism, his pre-communist journalism, which I think has been generally quite neglected. And I think it's a shame it's been neglected because I think it's really interesting, a lot of the stuff that he has to say there. And I think the context is very important for his early journalism. So he, some of you might know that he becomes an editor and writer for the Rheinische Zeitung in Cologne. And this is part of Prussia at the time. And Prussia is, of course, incredibly reactionary at the time. So there's pre-publication censorship of all newspapers. So everything that Marx and his fellow journalists write gets submitted to the censor in the evening, who approves or not approves it, and then only then does it get published the next day. So it's an incredibly restrictive system, and that makes a huge difference to what Marx is actually able to publish. And so he specifically argues that the most that we can kind of get away with in this newspaper is a kind of reformist liberalism, and we've got to be a bit more careful about our radical and revolutionary republicanism behind the scenes. And yet we still get some of those ideas coming through in his writings, and I'll just lead you through some of the things that I think are quite interesting from those writings. One is that Marx defends the importance of press freedom and the rule of law. So he tells us, for example, I not at all believe that persons can be a guarantee against laws. On the contrary, I believe that laws must be a guarantee against persons. No one, not even the most excellent legislator, can be allowed to put himself above the law he gets made. And then he tells us, I think this is a very interesting point he makes about the difference between censorship, so what is the actual system that's going on in Prussia at that time, and what would be the proper regulation of the press through a press law. And he says that would be as different as arbitrariness and freedom. So then we start to get Marx differentiating, or like putting freedom as being the opposite of arbitrary power. And he then starts to specify that a little bit more, what he means by that, and what its relationship to law, interestingly, with me. So he tells, for instance, that laws are not repressive measures against freedom. Laws are rather positive and clear universal norms in which freedom has applied an impersonal, theoretical existence independent of the arbitrariness of the individual. A statute book is a people's Bible of freedom. So here you get Marx moving against that idea, someone like freedom is non-interference, in which all laws inherently restrict your freedom, to the idea that law is actually a constituent of your freedom. As it removes the arbitrary power to which you are subjected to and makes it kind of a controlled form of power. But that's not enough, Marx says. In order for law to guarantee your freedom, it can't just be that it is, let's say the kind of various features that law has. It has to be made in a certain way, and that is, it has to be democratically made. So it has to be made by the people. And he tells us there that law is non-arbitrary, but law is the conscious expression of the popular will, and that it originates with it and is created by it. So there you get Marx making that democratic connection to freedom and to the law. And then finally, I think an interesting theme to bring out is what Marx has to say about representation and participation. So again, the situation when it comes to representation in Prussia is incredibly restrictive, semi-feudal. They don't even have a national assembly in Prussia. And Marx is, a lot of liberals are arguing that Prussia should switch to something along the lines of what goes on in France or Britain at the time. And Marx says explicitly that that is not even close to being enough. We need a far more radical form of representation. And he kind of gives us some hints about what that might look like, but of course can't say very much. We also get a few senses of what he thinks about a more kind of involved popular polity would look like. He tells us, for example, he talks about the importance of transforming the mysterious priestly nature of the state into a clear-cut entity of the ordinary people, accessible to all and belonging to all, making the state the flesh and blood of its citizens. I include this picture, by the way. This is Marx being depicted as Prometheus. Some of you might recognize it. It's when the Rheinische Zeitung then gets shut down by the Prussian censors, despite Marx's careful attempts to stay within what he thought the possibilities were. Okay, so that's in the early journalism. Once he's then freed, and I then talk about he's able to speak a little bit more freely or privately when he then undertakes his critique of Hegel. Some of you might recognize this is a very important text he writes in 1843. And so I then kind of pick out the various criticisms that Marx has of Hegel's constitutional monarchy, right? So that kind of liberal centrist model that Hegel is defending against a more right-wing model of Prussia, often confused that Hegel is somehow a defender of Prussian absolutism. Not at all the case. Hegel is, at least in terms of political structures, clearly a liberal. But Marx says that's not enough, and radicalized and argues for radicalizing in various Republican ways. So, for instance, when it comes to sovereignty, Hegel defends monarchical sovereignty, Marx defends popular sovereignty against it. When it comes to the legislature and popular participation, Hegel has an incredibly restrictive system. So he wants an upper house of a landed aristocracy, a lower house with a property franchise, and with no instructions or controls on representatives. And Marx then defends the opposite. He rejects the idea that a particular race of men could be entrusted with the highest dignity of the legislature by birthright, as an aristocratic house. He says that everyone should have the right to be real active members of the state. And then he rejects the idea that there should be no controls or instructions for representatives, because that would mean that they are no longer mandatories of the people. And then finally, he also rejects Hegel's idea of the bureaucracy. So Hegel, of course, famously defends the idea of the bureaucracy as a kind of supposed neutral actor that defends the common good and acts for all. And Marx says that's just an illusion. And actually what we need is the people to carry out the public administration by themselves. So you get this kind of radical democratic vision in various kind of ways about legislature, about bureaucracy, administration, sovereignty. So that's the kind of early Republican, Marx's early republicanism. This is about 1842, 1843. And then over the course of 1843 to 1844, he kind of slowly transitions to communism, and that which finally takes place in Paris, I would argue, in 1844. He moves there after the French society was shut down. Now, this transition to communism is, I think, so it is a transition insofar as he's, let's say, moving ideology, he's moving political formation, he's now acting with different people and different groups as a result of it. But it also carries with him, and this is really what I'm trying to argue in the book, in various ways, important Republican elements to it. And that has both political and social aspects. And I'm going to go over that. So just to kind of summarize, I think politically, so it carries over various Republican things while also leaving behind some Republican things. That was the way I would try to characterize that middle period. So politically, it means, for example, the continuation of his belief in the importance of a democratic republic and universal suffrage. And yet he loses some of the emphasis on more radical ideas about representation and participation in public administration. And then socially, he continues to express a Republican idea of freedom, but now directed towards the social sphere to criticize the arbitrary power of capitalists. And yet at the same time, he also rejects the Republican political economy of small-scale property owners. So there's a kind of integration and rejection of Republican views when he converts from republicanism to communism. So let me start with the political side of things. Marx's kind of integration of various Republican political ideas. Now, why is that so important, or why is that so interesting? So I think in order to get a sense of why that is so original, what Marx is doing, I think we have to get a sense of what socialism looks like at the time in which Marx converts to socialism. So here's a kind of fun diagram picture or drawing from 1850, which shows you the panoply of socialist options on the table in 1850, right? So you've got the Führerists with Victor Considérant, his Alessandrian ideas. You've got Etienne Cabet over here, with Louis Blanc. I can't even read Willem Proudhon is over here. And all of these options are on the table for people to choose from what socialism could mean in the 1840s. And one overwhelming thing that kind of defines nearly all of them at the time in which Marx kind of converts to socialism is that they are incredibly anti-political and anti-democratic in a way that I think is really hard for us to understand when we think of socialism as being deeply politicized in various ways. And they actually, at the time, so many of them are defining themselves against the idea of politics, against the idea of democracy. And because I think this point is so important, I want to kind of go over kind of some examples of this, about this kind of anti-political, anti-democratic aspect of socialism. So we can look, for example, at the kind of supposed triumvirate of socialist founders. A bit problematically, I don't think that's the way we should think about it, but it's often thought about that in terms of Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Robert Owen, and look at what some of their political ideas were, right? So, of course, Saint-Simon has the deeply characterized by the belief in technocracy and the belief that engineers and scientists are the people who should rule. And that's an idea he develops in opposition to democracy. So he tells us that political liberty, the right to participate in public affairs, is the most complete and most obvious proof of the vagueness and uncertainty which still shroud political ideas. In future, the cultivation of politics will be entrusted exclusively to a special class of scientists who will impose silence on all twaddle. Robert Owen, right? Similarly, and then what argues that it is not universal suffrage, vote by ballots, and annual parliaments that can affect that which is now required for the people. And that, it's not a statement in a vacuum. He's arguing against chartism, then emerging at the time, right? So there is a kind of working class movement arguing for democracy, and the early socialists are defining themselves against that and saying that is entirely the wrong way now to go. And instead, they famously argue, of course, for various communitarian answers, right? So in the case of Robert Owen, you have these parallelograms. In the case of Fourier, the phalanxes. And that these kind of small scale experiments set up in rural America, for instance, will then kind of peacefully spread socialism around the world. And that's kind of the alternative they're developing to that kind of democratic Republican argument that is so influential with Chartists, various French working class radicals. And that's what early socialism looks like. And it's kind of spread by their followers. So Zoe Gatti de Montemont, who's an incredibly important early Fourierist who kind of spreads Fourier's ideas. She argues that long have we searched for the remedy for people's ailments and political struggle, we now recognize that the evil resides in the very organization of society. The end we pursue is purely social. We set aside all political questions. Right? So they're refusing to engage in anything about political reform, political revolution, political struggle, all things that they think are irrelevant as to socialism. So that's kind of like the kind of early generations of socialism. It's also true, sorry, I keep forgetting I have the mouse here. It's also true of the German socialists that Marx and Engels are kind of part of the milieu that they join, as it were, in the 1840s in Paris. The German socialists who are in Paris, a huge German community in Paris, who also kind of carry over that early anti-political and anti-democratic ideas. Hermann Sennig, not a very important figure, but one that Engels argues against at some point, tells us that, asks, will the Republic pay our debts? Will it redeem our pawned goods? It's not going to, and so it tells us no political institutions are capable of abolishing them. So he's part of a grouping of socialists that Marx and Engels call the true socialists. Some of you might have heard the term. It's not something they call themselves, it's something that Marx invents for them, a little bit like the term utopian socialism. So Marx and Engels are quite good at that, defining currents of socialism in that way. And one of the things that Marx and Engels so heavily criticized them for, as we see, is this kind of anti-political aspect to them. But that also represents a bit of a shift in Engels' thinking, at least. So to give a sense of just how extensive this anti-political, anti-democratic, it's worth taking a look at Engels' early thought before he becomes, let's say, a Republican communist and is just a communist. So he tells us that the Owenists laugh at the mere Republicans, since the Republic would be just as hypocritical, just as theological as monarchy. Every kind of government is alike objectionable, no matter whether it's democracy, aristocracy, or monarchy. And the interesting thing is about Engels' thought, along with socialists, is that this is a principled objection to democracy and majority rule, right? So he tells us that the abolition of all government by force and by majority, and then instead a mere administration, you can see the kind of influence of Saint-Simon there. And then the argues that what we will need in the future is to nominate all the officers of administration, not by a majority of the community at large, but by those who only have the knowledge of the particular kind of work. So it's a kind of technocratic view, right? Those with the knowledge to do this should carry out decisions, not the people who aren't capable of doing so. And this is a really great feature of what Engels proposes at the time. He said we should choose these people who sit at the very top of the administration by the fittest person by means of some kind of prized essays. So this is what early socialism looks like, right? And this is what Marx and Engels eventually come to define themselves against in the mid to late 1840s. And they'll bring their Republican inheritance, well, in Marx, both of their cases a bit more complicated in Engels' case, bring their Republican inheritance to criticize these anti-political features. And you can see that explicitly in Marx's case. So before he becomes a communist, he criticizes socialists while he's still a Republican for the fact that they don't care about political questions. So it's one of the criticisms he already has as a Republican before he becomes a socialist. And then he then integrates that into a new form of socialism, a Republican form of socialism, which is committed to politics and is committed to democracy. And you see that in the most important political statement that they make in the Communist Manifesto, where they say that the first step in the revolution by the working class is the fight for democracy. And so hopefully with that background, you see how big a change that statement is from Saint-Simon, from Owen, from Fourier, from the various German socialists to be committed to democracy and politics in that way. So that is, I think, a really important way in which they integrate republicanism into their communism. Right? And I think that's really important to understand how they fashion a republican communism. We had to fight against other forms of socialism and communism that were opposed to it in order to win that argument. But I also think that there's a bit of a sub-story as well that's important, is that something does get a little bit lost in this kind of transition to communism. And that, Marx integrates some of his early beliefs, but some of them fall by the wayside. So this vision he has of kind of a deeply participatory form of democracy, representation, administration, that falls away a little bit in this period. And we get a kind of much more, let's say, I use maybe superficial is the word that comes to mind, but that's the word I'll use. I don't know if that's a superficial account of what democracy involves that basically reduces it to the idea of universal suffrage, and it doesn't have anything else to it. So Engels tells us, for example, that the English working class has no guarantee for bettering their social position unless by universal suffrage, which would enable them to see the majority of working men in the House of Commons. Marx tells us that universal suffrage is the equivalent of political power for the working class of England. So here, there's no kind of, let's say, extra controls on representatives. There's no vision that people need to carry out their own administration by themselves. That kind of falls a little bit by the wayside. So that's the political side of things. What happens on the social side of things? So this part of the presentation, I have to say, was the bit that I was hoping to work on before this happened on Saturday. So it's a little bit unfinished. I apologize for that. It's a bit hard to use my computer with just this one hand. So what happens on the social side of things? Well, so I guess the story again I want to tell you there is that Marx integrates very important Republican themes about freedom and domination into his critique of political economy, and then also uses that, interestingly, to criticize what is Republicans' idea of political economy. So, there's plenty of examples. Some of the photos are missing. So he tells us, for example, in the early writings very clearly that freedom is related to domination in this way. So if unfrictivity means working under the domination, the coercion, and the yoke of another man, and he uses that idea of freedom to criticize the arbitrary power that capitalist employers exercise over their employees in the workplace. And in the book, I go into various ways in which very similar arguments that he raises against, let's say, Prussian officials in the early 1840s, he makes those same kind of arguments against capitalists when he's writing about political economy. So you see that kind of transferal concern of arbitrary power in the political sphere coming over into his concern of arbitrary power in the social sphere. That's true of his early writings. It's also true of what he says in Capital. So the very interesting section in Capital where Marx argues that in the factory code, capitalist formulates his autocratic power over his workers like a private legislature, and purely as an emanation of his own will, unaccompanied by either the separation of powers, otherwise so much approved of by the bourgeoisie, or a still more approved representative system. So what he's saying there is that the kind of arbitrary power that the capitalist exercises inside of the factory would be unacceptable. That level of arbitrary power would be unacceptable to the liberal bourgeoisie outside of the factory, where we have to have representation and we have to have the separation of powers to limit that arbitrary power. But suddenly, once you walk into the factory gate, that kind of power is totally acceptable. Kind of public-private sphere divided that liberalism bourgeois relies upon. And that's very interesting that Marx, at that paragraph, then one of the longer footnotes that he has in Capital, extracts a very long text paragraph from Engels, from the condition of the working class in England. I'll just read a small section of it, where Engels says that the slavery in which the bourgeoisie holds the proletariat chain is nowhere more conspicuous than in the factory system. Here ends all freedom in law, and in fact, inside the factory, the employer is absolute lawgiver. He makes regulations at will, changes and adds to his codex of pleasure. So again, you're getting that explicit connection to freedom and the idea that because the capitalist acts at their own will without any sort of control on their power, that makes the proletariat free. And I think, yeah, Marx and Engels are just writings are just littered with these examples of that kind of individual arbitrary power. But then something I tried to talk a bit about in the book as well is that it's not just about this individual story, of course, right? About you and your individual capitalist who's ruling over you like an absolute monarch. Marx, of course, also adds much more structural analysis to that. And that's something that I go into in that chapter in the book, talking about the way in which it's not just the single capitalist, but the capitalist class who exercises domination over you. And that's something that Marx thinks is new about social domination in capitalism compared to previous forms of domination. So he tells us in Capital that the Roman slave is held by chains, the wage labor is bound to his owner by invisible threads. So their domination is much less visible, much less clearly the case. And it's because the appearance of independence, so it's ideological aspect to it as well, is maintained by the constant change in the person of the individual employer. And this owner is not the individual capitalist, but the capitalist class. And then something that I won't talk about so much, but I do talk about quite a bit in the book, is the way in which Marx, uses this, of course, analysis to criticize the function of capitalism and to kind of obviously come to his alternative defense of common ownership of property and its production. But of course, that isn't the only response that one can have to capitalism. And that's something is that 19th century Republicans developed their own non-socialist alternative to capitalism based on kind of not common ownership, but universalizing property for all. So kind of political economy of artisans and peasant workers. And that's the kind of Republican response to capitalism, and Marx criticizes that, as being just an outdated and an impossibility given the advance of capitalism. And he defends, these an alternative of common ownership. At one point, particularly for his work with the International Working Men's Association, becomes very much more favorable towards cooperatives. And he tells us that cooperatives show us that we can replace the despotic system of the subordination of labor to capital, and that can be superseded by the Republican and beneficent system of the association of free and equal producers. So you get that explicitly Republican use of language here as well. So that's, a glimpse of some of the social aspects of it. But there's more detail in the book, so maybe it's not giving away everything. All right, so those are the kind of two first parts of the book. And then I have one final closing chapter, which deals with the Paris Commune. And so here I'm looking at the ways in which Marx's thought was kind of disrupted and changed by his viewing of the Paris Commune, and how that led him back to some of his earliest radical Republican ideas, at least in terms of politics. And he says that explicitly when he does, him and Engels write a new preface to the Communist Manifesto, saying that one of the things in which it was outdated is that we didn't clearly enough say that we have to transform the existing bourgeois state. It's not democratic enough as it stands in order to bring about socialism. And that has then various features. So one is, there's also a picture here. So one is about representation. So in his writings on the Paris Commune, he defends frequent elections, the importance of being able to recall representatives, the importance of the imperative mandate, where you give binding instructions to your representative. And he tells us if those things were when those things were instituted in the Paris Commune, instead of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to misrepresent the people in Parliament, universal suffrage was to serve the people. So you get kind of a transformation of what representation means from kind of rulers over you that you don't control to kind of real delegates or representatives of the people. And then when it comes to participation in public administration, he transforms those same systems of accountability for the legislative and representative realm to system of public administration, and argues that all state administrators, it's a bit unclear about how extensive when he says all, but need to be elected or appointed by the legislature and be recallable as well. So you get these kind of same mechanisms of control. And that would, he says, replace the courteous master of the people, which is always removable servants, not responsibility by a real responsibility, as they act continuously under public supervision. And he kind of rails against what he calls the delusion as if administration and political government were mysteries, transcendent functions that are even entrusted to their hands between the past. Of course, totally different to the kind of technocratic image that Saint-Simon or even the early Engels gives us. And then interestingly, when he's talking a few years later, criticizing some trends in the is German social democracy, kind of makes a connection again back to freedom as well. That tells us that freedom consists in transforming the state from an organ superimposed upon society into one completely subordinate to it. Right. So again, it's a kind of political connection to the idea of freedom. It's about, or at least one aspect to freedom is about having a state that you properly control, or state might be the wrong word, a polity that you control and subordinate to the popular control. Okay, So that's the kind of the overall three-part argument that I made in the book. Then I'll just end with a couple of things that I hope might be taken from the book in terms of what it says about Marx more broadly, and maybe even about socialist politics. So one is a kind of point about democracy in politics, I suppose. So, I think that, this won't be news to anyone in the room, really, but there is a kind of, I don't think anyone would disagree with this in the room, but like, there is a very kind of common way of presenting Marx among certain academics as being in some way opposed to politics or an anti-political thinker. Think about people like Hannah Arendt, Gareth Edwin Jones, some of the other names slip my mind that I cited in the book, but it's a very common representation in literature. And I think I just think it's entirely false. I think it's kind of funny for academics who probably haven't done much political in their lives to complain about Marx not being political enough, but maybe that's an unfair ad hominem. But I think just more importantly, one thing I try and get across in the book is that if you just actually look at socialism in the 1830s and the 1840s, it's just so obviously the case that Marx is not an anti-political socialist, but his whole life's work, or one of the aspects of his whole life's work, was to push against those anti-political themes in socialism that predominated at the time. Right. I mean, I wouldn't deny that there are some anti-political themes to Marx's work. I think that socialism is in some way committed to a certain anti-politics, and we can talk about that. But I think that that picture of Marx is just so wrong-headed, and I hope that through some of the contextual work that I do in the book, that might be shifted. And that's closely connected, of course, also to democracy, and that's why I've chosen this picture. This is from 1890 or so, which kind of nicely shows, going to, well, one to the kind of Republican future, liberty, equality, and fraternity in the future, kind of connecting it to socialism, that kind of way in which Republican iconography continued to be important to socialists in the late 19th century. But the interesting, but the path to it goes through universal suffrage, right? And I think that's something, trying to come across in the book is, how committed Marx was, the idea that how important democracy was to him. But of course, not just as this image suggests of just universal suffrage. What I take away from Marx's writing on the Paris Commune, that we need a different form of democracy compared to what democracy is understood by today, which implies much greater control over our legislatures and a much greater involvement in public administration. So that's kind of one aspect, this idea of democracy and politics. And the second is the idea of freedom. So I think that the kind of, conception of what Marx's relationship to freedom looks something along the lines of this, right? He is the enemy of freedom, in very whatever ways, and the communism is about dictatorship and so forth. Now, of course, I don't think that I need to tell anyone in the room, of course, that is not the case. Of course, Marx is committed to freedom. But I think that even amongst presentations of Marx, that when Marx gets connected to the idea of freedom, I think it's mostly an idea of positive freedom, that it's all about kind of self-realization in work and things like this. And I don't deny that those are aspects to what Marx means by freedom, but I think the Republican elements of what Marx means by freedom has been neglected. And I hope that comes out in the book, that one thing, the important aspect of what Marx meant by freedom is an opposition to arbitrary power, whether in the political sphere, in the social sphere, and the importance of overcoming that. And I hope that maybe in some ways that might also show why Republican freedom might be of interest to the left to revive today as a value to talk about. All right, that's me finished.